Paul Cavey, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Give the government some confidence. Think about the economy more broadly going well for China. And the more interesting story is you look at TSMC.
Hi, I'm Paul Cavey from East Asia Econ. It's a research service looking at big economies of Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Today I want to start with a puzzle, and that puzzle is with Korea, where the labour market looks like it's tightest, and yet wage growth is slowing. Why would that be the case? And I think the answer is really tells us a lot about ageing, participation rates and changes in the labour market that are happening, and therefore has relevance for the other economies in Asia as well. So it's an important part of understanding how aging affects the economies, and we can see that playing out real time in Korea. So again, let's start with the puzzle. So when you look at the region as a whole, the economy where the labour market looks like it's recovered most quickly since the pandemic is Korea. So employment has risen, is now well above the previous high. Unemployment has dropped below 3% for the first time in a generation or so. So the labour market looks like it's very tight. Now, in the rest of the region, that's also true, where we get data at least. I'm not talking about China today because China's labour market data aren't particularly useful, but at least in terms of the other big economies, Japan and Taiwan, the labour markets also look like they're quite tight. Unemployment rates are low, but there hasn't been that same increase in employment as there's been in Korea. So you think that in Korea, the labour market is the tightest if you just looked at the employment numbers. However, when you look at the wage numbers, in Korea, you're not seeing the acceleration in wages that would suggest the labour market really is that tight. Whereas in Japan and Taiwan, wage growth is actually accelerating. So in Japan, that's particularly obvious in the data. So the most recent data point we had from Japan, in fact, was that part-time wage growth has now reached 5.5%. So that is actually pretty strong relative to any developed economy. So, a very different situation in Japan to the situation we've seen in the past. But in Taiwan also, it's very clear that wage growth is accelerating, not as dramatically as in Japan. But there's now been two clear pickups in manufacturing wage growth over the last 10 years or so. So in both economies, wage growth is accelerating in a way that's not being seen in Korea, even though the labour market data in Korea would suggest that the labour market is tighter. So that's the first part. There's a puzzle here. And I think there's two explanations of why that puzzle exists and how to answer it. So one is the supply side. So you think about the supply side. In Korea, demand for employment has been particularly strong. So it looks like more people are entering the workforce and therefore the labour market should be tightening. And that then is offsetting the changes in demographics. So if you think about demographics alone in the region, it would suggest that actually employment should be falling for the simple reason that there's less people. So working populations are shrinking because of the aging of the populations that's happening. Obviously, with less people, employment should be coming down. Now, that hasn't been happening in Korea, and in fact, hasn't been happening in Japan either over the course of the last 20 or 30 years or so. And so this is an important part of the puzzle. And it's because of these changes in the structural side of the labour market that are happening that help to explain why it looks on the surface like the labour market in Korea is tight, but in fact, wages aren't responding in the same way. And it's really all about the increase in their participation rates. And so in Japan and Korea in particular, the changes and the participation rate is the proportion of the people of a particular age that choose to work and choose to enter the workforce. And what you've seen in both of these economies over the course of the last 20 years or so, particularly over the course of the last 10 years, is dramatic increases in that participation rate. And that's being led by two groups of workers in particular, female workers and elderly workers. And that process was led by Japan, but Korea has been catching up over the course of the last 5 years or so, particularly since the pandemic. And so what you're seeing is an increasing number of women coming into the workforce. And now, in Japan and Korea now, it's no longer true that the female participation rate is particularly low relative to the rest of the world. That's obviously a big change from where we were 30 years ago or so. And at the same time, the elderly participation rates in these economies is also rising, and actually in Korea also quite high. And so why is this important? Because obviously it means that there is the link between population and the work and the number of people available to work isn't set in stone. It depends on the proportion of people of that working age that choose to make themselves available to go and work. And what we're seeing in these economies is more people choosing to go and work, not staying at home. And as a result, there's more flexibility in the labour markets than would appear apparent just based on what's happening with the demographics. It also means that the labour market data become less important in thinking about the impact on wages. And so obviously, if you're having a big increase in the supply of workers, employment can go up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the labour market is tightening. And in fact, that's particularly true, therefore, in Korea, because what's been happening to allow this process of participation rates to rise is an increase in the number of part-time workers. And so it's easier for, female workers or older workers who want to be able to come and work for a few hours each week to make a bit more money, but they have other, obligations that they have and they don't want to work all the time. It's easier to accommodate those workers if the labour market becomes more flexible and offers more part-time workers. But if that's the process that's playing out, it doesn't mean that the number of hours worked in the economy overall goes up. And that really is the big thing in Korea, that as much as the number of people working is rising, the average number of hours that each person is working is falling. And as a result, the aggregate number of hours being worked in the economy, which, if you like, is sort of some reflection of demand overall, that isn't nearly as high as it was in 2019. So one answer to this puzzle is, on the one hand, you have more people entering the workforce, so the employment side looks like it's quite tight. On the other hand, when you look at the number of hours being worked, it's not nearly as impressive. And that disjoint between those two things is the increase in their participation rate and the increase in the number of part-time workers working in the economy, which suggests that demand isn't nearly so strong as it would be just looking at the employment numbers. Now, that process has also been seen in Japan, has been seen over the course of the last, decades, really, that there's been a steady increase in the number of part-time workers, up to about 30% of the total thereabouts, really happening since the bubble burst in the early 1990s, that this increase in part-time workers was used by companies as a way to cut their costs and therefore to allow them to stay in business even as the economy was doing less well. And so that process is also being played out, which is also seen in a fall in the aggregate number of working hours. Where this isn't being seen is in Taiwan. And so in Taiwan has many of the same demographic issues as these other economies. So the population is aging rapidly. There's been a fall in the number of young people, a rise in the number of older people, like all of the same issues which are dragging down the overall population, as is seen in Korea and Japan. Those issues are very much prevalent in Taiwan. But what we're not seeing in Taiwan is an increase in their participation rates. Female workers, it is increasing, but nowhere near as rapidly as in the rest of the region. And remarkably, the retirement age in Taiwan is remarkably low compared with the rest of the region. And the number of older people working is much lower than it is elsewhere. And so there isn't that flexibility in the labour market that's being seen. And one big reason for this is because of the part-time worker stuff. So in Taiwan, unlike these other economies, there isn't an increase in the proportion of jobs which are part-time workers. And therefore, there isn't that flexibility in the labour market that allows more people who want to have a more flexible working style to come back and work. Why is this important? Because if the population overall isn't increasing, but also the participation rate isn't rising, the demographics start to have a constraining impact on the labour market in a way which isn't seen elsewhere. And so when you look at the aggregate number of hours being worked in Taiwan, it does remain very high. So unlike in Korea, where there's a disjoint between employment on the one hand and working hours on the other, in Taiwan that doesn't exist. So when we look at the labour market in Taiwan, where the unemployment rate is also like 20-year lows, that labour market signal is much more meaningful in Taiwan because it does suggest the labour market is much tighter because there isn't the change in the supply side that's happening in Korea. And again, that's something that then can be seen in the wage growth, where wage growth has started to pick up in Taiwan in a way that's not being seen elsewhere. So that's one aspect of what's been happening. Another important aspect of this is the underlying labour market dynamics, which if you look at like the rest of the region, over the course of the last few years, there has been a bit of an increase in the labour share as a percentage of GDP. In Taiwan, that's only just starting to happen. So this is another aspect, I think, of the importance of underlying changes in the labour market, that in Taiwan, it does seem like labour is now beginning to get a larger share of the economy than it has in the past, which is one of the reasons why the labour market is tighter. And it's also one of the reasons why wage inflation and inflation in Taiwan in general is higher than it has been in the past. So what does this mean? Like, what's the implications of all of this in thinking about like the economies and thinking about markets in these different economies? So I think the most important thing is when we look at Korea, some of the inflation numbers do actually remain quite robust in Korea, particularly private sector services inflation hasn't come down as much as I might have expected. But But I don't think there's a good labour market reason for that. It doesn't look like the labour market is particularly tight in Korea. Given how weak the cycle is, it's very easy to see the labour market actually slipping even further over the course of the next year or so. And as a result, it looks likely that wage growth will come down further, and therefore we should expect to see inflation coming down further as well. So that's the most likely outcome in Korea. In Japan, because Japan is so much more advanced in the aging process, as a result, as much as the participation rate has been increasing, it's difficult to see the participation rate increasing much more quickly than it has from here, just because it is now so high. At the same time, the demographics, because they're so much more advanced, the fall in the population is happening more quickly now in Japan. So the significance of both of those things is that the labour market should be much structurally tighter than it has been in any time in the course of the last 30 years or so. So tariffs are a big risk for Japan as they are for the rest of the region. But it does feel like the labour market is much more structurally tight in Japan because of how advanced we are with the aging process. And then similarly for Taiwan, it does feel also like the labour market here is structurally tight. But the reasons for that are different. The reason is not because the aging process is particularly advanced yet. That's going to happen, like it's inevitability over the course of the next 30 years or so. But the big reason here why the labour market is tight is because the labour market isn't flexible in the way that is in the rest of the region. And therefore, as long as demand remains strong, as it has done over the course of the last few years or so, it's much more likely to result in wage growth accelerating and therefore inflation to be higher. So in a sense, I think what we're seeing is sort of a reversal of some of the structural drivers in Asia. If you go back and think about these economies, 15, 20 years ago, it was very easy to think of Korea as being quite a high inflation economy and Taiwan's being a low inflation economy. It feels now like that's reversing. And in a situation, Taiwan is more likely to be a higher inflation economy. I don't think that necessarily means inflation being more than 2% or being particularly problematic, but at least inflation being higher than it has been historically, at the same time as inflation in Korea is likely to be lower than it has been historically, because the cycle is weaker, the economy is not doing so well, and the labour market is much more flexible than it is in Taiwan. And that, therefore, has implications for interest rates, and it has implications for the currencies. So I think this labour market stuff is very important for thinking about, the region generally. It tells us a lot about the aging process, and understanding the impact of aging on the economies is not nearly as linear as is always imagined, but also has big implications for where we stand with labour market statistics, what's happening with wage growth, and importantly, what that means for inflation and therefore for central banks. And so I think this is an important issue to be understanding. And if you want to understand more, find more of the charts, look at more of the data, please go to eastasiaecon.com. You can look at the Korea, Taiwan, Japan homepages where there's a bunch of charts, all of the data that can be downloaded, and hopefully that will tell you more. Thank you very much for watching.